So back in October of 2023, I was supposed to be in Israel and the Palestinian territories to do some meetings with civil society groups there who are pushing for peace. But because of the October 7th attacks, I wasn't able to go there. And I was actually coming from India where I was doing a reporting trip. So I actually stayed in India longer than I expected and just holed up in a hotel room and decided to read every book that I've either read before or wanted to read on the history of the Middle East and the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. And I turned that into a multi-part series called An Unbiased History of Israel and Palestine. And that got a ton of attention, and a lot of people from both sides of the debate really appreciated it. And we even won a Webby Award for Best Limited Series. And what I wanted to do here was take that work, expand on it, and do it in video form. So you could see videos and images of all the different people and players and maps that I'm talking about. And so that's what I'm going to do here. And we're going to break this into a few different parts. The first part is going to be up until from pre-independence all the way up through the late 1990s in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The second part is going to be from the late 1990s to the present day, kind of the Netanyahu era. And then the third part will be a deep dive on who Hamas is. And if these are really popular, we'll keep going and touch on a bunch more topics from Middle East history and that conflict. A few disclaimers before I start. This whole conflict has become a battle of historical anecdotes. Like certain people who have strong opinions about the conflict, I being one of them, are prone to just pick one particular fact or one particular moment in history and use that to make a point. And what I want to do here is try to provide as much depth and breadth as possible. Even though I have my opinions, my goal here is that you wouldn't know what my opinions are about the conflict by listening to this. My goal is that I am as objective as I possibly could be. It's impossible to be totally objective. And so that's the goal. It's also important to note that you aren't bound by any of this history. You could pick your own starting point if you want to pick a starting point for what you think is the most relevant period of time. But I won't tell you how you should feel about any given fact. What I want to do here is be as didactic as possible. So I'm going to be reading through a bunch of details. I'm not going to be animated. I'm not going to try to persuade you. I'm literally just going to lay them out and let you make a decision for yourself. I also don't speak Arabic or Hebrew, and my pronunciations are not going to be super great. So I apologize to people who speak those languages. And there's no one great unbiased history on this subject. But taken together, you read enough sources, I think you put it all together, and hopefully it's a helpful compilation of that history. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to break this pre-2000 period of time down into three different phases that I'm going to go through in the course of this first video. The first phase is going to be up to the establishment of the State of Israel. And I'm going to ask a few questions in this section. One is, who was there first and what significance do we give to that? Second is, what does it mean to be Jewish and what does it mean to be Arab and Palestinian? Or Jewish and Israeli, and what does it mean to be Arab and Palestinian? We're going to ask whether the establishment of the State of Israel was wise and moral, and we're going to ask if the Palestinians left of their own volition or whether they were forced out. Now, that's the first phase and first series of questions. Second phase is going to be the post-independence phase, what I think of as the phase of the conventional wars, so wars between Israel and its Arab neighbors. The key questions that we're going to ask here are who invaded who first, who is the aggressor, what to make of land captured in the course of battle, and what do external threats from Israel's neighbors do to shape its moral and tactical calculus in the next phase of this war, which this third phase we call the occupation and the rise of the PLO, Hamas, Hezbollah. So the sort of rise of the quasi-state, non-state actors and the rise of the occupation. And we're going to cover in that section the moral and tactical implications of occupation, the morality of guerrilla tactics and terrorism, the legitimacy of Palestinian leaders under occupation, the morality of settlement construction, American involvement, and the rise of Likud, the Likud party. So That lays out what we're going to do. Let's dive in here. What are we talking about? We're talking about a strip of land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. It's not much larger than Belgium or Maryland. Some people say it's the size of New Jersey. It has a population of 13 million people. Jews lived there from about 1500 BCE on, and in 64 BCE, the Romans conquered Jerusalem, and the area became a part of the Roman Empire. There's a ton of interesting history there. I've been there many times. You can go to places like Masada, where there's just absolutely captivating stories of battle between the Jews and the Israelites and the Romans. In 135 CE, after a series of revolts against Roman imperial rule, the Jews were dispersed. Some remained, but most settled in Europe and other parts of the Arab world. The area was conquered by Arab Muslims in the 7th century following the emergence of Islam in what is today Saudi Arabia. Over time, most of the population adopted Arabic as its language and Islam as its religion, but some Christians and Jews remained, not many, but enough. And in the 6th century, the area was conquered by Ottomans, the sort of Turkish dynasty, and they were Muslims but not Arabic speaking. And they conquered most of the Arab lands of the Middle East, and they wound up taking control of the 3 most holy sites for Muslims, Mecca, Medina, and Jerusalem. In the Ottoman Middle East, there was no officially designated area called Palestine. The area to the west of the Jordan River and south of Beirut was made up of 3 distinct administrative districts: Jerusalem, Nablus, and Acre, or Acre. I'm not sure how to say that. By 19th century, most Jews lived in the western parts of the Russian Empire. Many were forced to live under severe restrictions and violence that really picked up with the assassination of the Tsar Alexander in 1881. Jews were blamed, which led to a series of pogroms and officially approved riots. The climate became unsafe for Jews, which is why between 1882 and 1914, 2.5 million Jews left Russia, the vast majority for the U.S. and Europe. A small number, about 55,000, went to Palestine. This was aided by the development of the steamship. This period of time, especially the period between 1882 and 1903, this was called the first Aliyah, or the first ascent. Mostly farmers, mostly from Russia, what is today Poland, came over to what is now Israel and the Palestinian territories. The key thinker for the Jews during this period of time, or the what we call Zionists, was a man named Theodor Herzl. He was a lawyer and journalist. He wrote a book called The Jewish State, which was published in 1896. He called on Jews to form a single nation state. And in 1897, Herzl organized a congress in Switzerland to which the World Zionist Organization was formed. And Zionism, which is a word that had been used previously, but it was defined by them as the creation of a home for the Jewish people in Palestine. Herzl's goals were diplomatic support from a great power in Europe, financial support from the diaspora community in U.S. In Europe, and generally just facilitating the movement of people to the region. The Jewish National Fund was set up in 1901 to buy land in Palestine. The writer Israel Zangwill said that, quote, Palestine was a land without a people for people without a land. So that gives you a sense of how some people thought about it back then. The newspaper Philistine appealed to fellow Arabs not to sell land to Jewish immigrants, and there were increasing references to the term Palestine and Palestinian. So this, early sort of clash was set up, where some of the Arabs living there saw what was happening, didn't want to sell land. Some people obviously did sell land. Urban notables and the Arabic press called on the Ottoman government to halt immigration and land purchases, and the Ottomans caved, and they did impose some restrictions. In 1914, you had the outbreak of World War I, which is a key turning point of this war. The Jewish population at the time of the start of the war was around 75,000, which was about 7% of the population of the area. The Ottoman Empire joined the Central Powers, so Germany, Austria-Hungary. Thousands of Palestinians were drafted into the Ottoman army, and a smaller number of Jews. The Jewish community was cut off from Europe, including the flow of money and immigrants from Europe, basically dried up during that period of time. In late 1917, the Ottoman forces in Palestine were defeated by the British, and in December 1917, General Edmund Allenby led his troops into Jerusalem. During the war, Britain made a series of edicts that contradicted each other. There was an agreement between Henry McMahon, who is the British High Commissioner, in Egypt, and Hussein, who was the sheriff of Mecca and the leader of the Hashemite dynasty. Britain promised to support independence of the Arab countries if the Arabs sought advice on how to establish their government. Britain wanted to protect the Ottoman threat to the Suez Canal. They wanted to keep a sort of a route to Persian oil and to their empire in India. Britain deliberately kept the borders ambiguous, including the status of Palestine. This agreement also sowed the seeds of the Arab revolt against the Turks. The second such sort of agreement or announcement from the British was called the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which was named after the French and British leaders who signed it. They signed it in 1916, and this agreement looked ahead to the fall of the Ottoman Empire and decided that the Arab lands would be allocated to distinct French and British spheres of influence. Today's Syria and Lebanon went to the French, or were to go to the French. Sinai and Mesopotamia, so today's Iraq, were to go to the British. Palestine was going to be under some kind of hybrid international control. So that was 1916. But by far the most important edict, announcement, communique from the British is what we call the Balfour Declaration in 1917. And this was a letter written by British Secretary Arthur Balfour. He was the Foreign Secretary. And he wrote this letter to Lord Rothschild, who is an influential British Jew. And Balfour expressed support for a national home for Jews in Palestine, and with 65 words, threw open this entire debate. He said, quote, "His Majesty's government views with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. The government will make every effort to bring this about. It is clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may harm the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine or the rights of the political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country." This Balfour Declaration didn't specify whether this was a state with its own borders or its own government, but it was read by many Jews for the next 30 years as a promise by the British government of a Jewish state. Now, what was the motivation behind this Balfour Declaration? Number one, the members of the British government wanted to win over support of influential Jews, both in U.S. and Russia, for the Allied cause. They also wanted an overland route to oil reserves of Iraq, and they were planning to build a pipeline from Iraq to the port of Haifa in Palestine, where it could be shipped to Britain. Palestine was also 100 miles north of the Suez Canal. Balfour said in 1919, quote, "We are not dealing with the wishes of an existing community, but are consciously seeking to reconstitute a new community and definitely building for a numerical Jewish majority in the future," end quote. So Balfour didn't really take seriously the existence of an indigenous population there that was non-Jewish. In 1920, the International Conference in San Remo, Italy, basically continued this discussion, and Britain and France acquired mandates over the Arab lands taken from the Ottomans. They were ordered to, quote, "govern until such time as the Arab countries are able to stand alone." France was given control over Syria and Lebanon. Britain was given Iraq, Palestine, and what became known as Transjordan. In 1923, those awards were formally recognized by the League of Nations, so the precursor to the United Nations. Under Article 22 of the League's covenant, France and Britain were responsible for preparing the countries for self-government. In the case of Palestine, the Balfour Declaration was written into the British mandate and was made more favorable to the Zionists. The British were authorized to lease with a Jewish agency to facilitate Jewish immigration and to encourage the close settlement by the Jews on the land. There were no specific references to the Arabs. Britain offered an elected legislative assembly to the Arabs in 1922 and 1928, but refused to give them a majority of seats, so the Arabs declined. Palestinian historian Rashid Khalidi has said that Arabs of Palestine felt that they were in a, quote, iron cage. Throughout the 1920s, the British government talked out of both sides of their mouths, reassuring Arabs they had no intention of creating a Jewish state in Palestine. The first High Commissioner of Palestine was a man named Sir Herbert Samuel, and he said that Britain had never consented and would never consent to the establishment of a Jewish state. Winston Churchill, who was then colonial secretary, made similar assurances. In 1920, the Jews made up 10% of the population, and in 1927 and 1928, more emigrated than immigrated. The U.S. and Europe were popular destinations. At the time, sort of key institutions for the Jews in the area were, number one, the Jewish Agency, which was in practice the government of the Jewish population of Palestine. They liaised with the British government. They controlled settlement building. Another key institution was called Histadrut. They were a Zionist labor federation. They promoted Jewish workers. The early leader of that organization was a man named David Ben-Gurion. He's kind of like the George Washington of Israel. He became the first leader of Israel, and he came from Poland at the age of 20. He was an ardent socialist and was committed to the development of kibbutzim, so these sort of socialist collectives that exist till this day. He was a dominant figure in the interwar years. He became the head of the Jewish Agency in 1935, and in 1948 became the first prime minister of Israel. His circles within Histadrut and elsewhere became what is known as the Israeli Labor Party, which is kind of like the Democratic Party of Israel. In the 1920s, Jewish land holdings doubled. In the post-war years, affluent and middle-class Palestinian families and religious leaders formed the Muslim-Christian associations. These bodies asserted a Palestinian sense of national identity. They said, quote, Palestine is Arab, its language is Arabic. We want to see this formally recognized. I'll pause there to say that what stands out in these early days amongst these sort of Arabs and Palestinians is that, you know, one could use the word secular or at least religiously diverse. You know, that, as I said, this was a Muslim-Christian associations were kind of some of the key institutions in the area. It wasn't what you see in some of the institutions today, which is like from Hamas, for example, which are explicitly Islamic or Islamist even organizations. As time goes on, those institutions become less and less secular, or at least religiously diverse, and they become more explicitly Islamic or Islamist. Now back to the history here. In the 1920s, Arab attacks on settlements picked up in Jerusalem in 1920, Haifa in 1921, but violence in 1929 was by far the most significant. In the lead-up in 1928, there was a dispute over control and access to the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem. Jews believed it to be the last remaining part of the ancient Jewish temple of King Solomon. The walls form the western limit of what Muslims call Haram al-Sharif and the Jews call the Temple Mount. The gold-top dome of the rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque were built on the rock from which Muslims believe the Prophet Muhammad ascended to heaven. This would be a disputed piece of land and an infrastructure to this very day. During that dispute, several Jews in Jerusalem were killed, and the violence spilled over to the surrounding areas with attacks on the Jewish kibbutzim. Muslims in Hebron attacked the Jewish quarter, killing 64. British troops responded, killing Arabs. All in all, 113 Jews and 116 Arabs were killed in Jerusalem, Hebron, and other places. The aftermath of that sort of series of attacks and spats reinforced Zionism. So there were some Jews, a pretty significant amount of them at the time, that hadn't been Zionists, but they gravitated more in that direction because they looked to the Zionist leadership for protection. They wanted more separation. The British responded with the Passfield White Papers, which proposed restrictions on immigration and land sales to Jews. Members of the British Conservative Party beat this back and reaffirmed the country's commitment to a Jewish national home. For Arabs, this was another betrayal. Jewish immigration began to soar after 1933, when Hitler came to power. The number of annual immigrants to Palestine increased from 10,000 in 1932 to 62,000 in 1935. It's important to pause and step back here and give you a little bit about the trends. So in 1919, there were 65,000 Jews in the area and 700,000 Arabs. 10 years later, in 1929, there were 160,000 Jews and 1 million Arabs. Then in 1939, 10 more years later, 430,000 Jews, 1.2 million Arabs, and in 1947, 600,000 Jews to 1.3 million Arabs. So from 1919 to 1947, the Jewish population in the area goes from 65,000 to 600,000. At the same time, the Arab population goes from 700,000 to 1.3 million. So the Arab population is increasing, but increasing in a linear fashion, whilst the Jewish population is probably a little bit more exponential. But despite all that, by 1947, Jews are still outnumbered, but the numbers are closer. It's important to just note here, and this is not an explainer on the Holocaust, but the Holocaust looms large in the story because it explains a lot about the motivation to move, to emigrate, to establish the state of Israel. Hitler and the Nazis would go on to kill some 6 million Jews during that war. They wound up murdering 2/3 of Europe's Jewish population. That obviously plays a huge part in the desire to find a safe country to populate and to get out of Europe or to go somewhere where Jews control their own government. At that time, anti-British and anti-Zionist agitation became more militant. A key figure here is a man named Izz ad-Din al-Qassam, who is a Syrian-born militant revolutionary, depending on how you look at it. He led a 1935 guerrilla war, but was quickly hunted down and killed by the British. He became a hero to the Palestinian cause. Thousands attended his funeral in a demonstration of national unity. He would become a symbol of the resistance up until this day. There is a terrorist organization called the Al-Qassam Brigades, who obviously, named their organization after him. In 1937, a commission of inquiry from the British government interviewed over 100 people in Palestine, British, Jewish, Arab. Zionists demanded unlimited immigration and land sales. Arab leaders called for an Arab state of Palestine and expulsion of all Jews who immigrated since World War I. The report concluded that cooperation between Jews and Arabs was impossible. Quote, there is no common ground between them. Their national aspirations are incompatible. They found that the League of Nations mandate was unworkable. They recommended partitioning Palestine into two states, one Jewish and one Arab. The Jewish state would include 20% of Palestine. The plan accepted the concept of population transfer between the territories and envisioned 200,000 Arabs transferred out of the Jewish areas and 1,250 Jews transferred the other way. The Jewish Agency agreed to that plan, though some of its members, like Ben-Gurion, wanted more. Arabs opposed the plan immediately. In 1936 to 1939, there was an Arab revolt in the countryside. It was inspired by the example of Al-Qassam. They carried out attacks on British forces and Jewish settlements, and the British ruthlessly cracked down with mass arrests, assassinations, and deportations. By 1939, Jews made up 30% of Palestine. In 1939, also, the British issued a white paper declaring they wanted an independent Palestine within 10 years. It would be neither a Jewish nor an Arab state, but one in which Arabs and Jews shared governing. So you can see the British are kind of going all over the place. Is it a two-state solution? Is it a one-state solution? Is there more Jewish control, more Arab control, etc.? This white paper also said that Britain would restrict Jewish immigration. As fighting with the Nazis broke out, Ben-Gurion said that Jews would be joining the fighting with the British against the Nazis, but the Jews would, quote, fight with the British as though there was no white paper and would fight against the white paper as if there was no war. So obviously that white paper was not very popular with the Israelis and Jews. Jewish experience fighting in the British Army in the war would prove super crucial to the years ahead. They gained military training and readiness. And when the war ended in 1945, the British announced there would be no change in their policy in Palestine, no increase in immigration, and no separate Jewish state. Ben-Gurion and other Zionists realized that the name of the game was now the U.S., who was now the emerging power post-World War II, and the U.S. had a lot of Jews. So there were 4.5 million Jews living in the U.S., 2 million in my hometown of New York City alone. And their pressure worked. In April 1946, Harry Truman called on the British government to allow immediate entry of 100,000 Jewish refugees. 6 months later, he came out in support of the partition of Palestine. The British authorities stopped boatloads of Jewish immigrants from landing in Palestine, which created a whole host of international incidents. By July 1946, the Irgun, which was a Zionist paramilitary organization, carried out an attack on the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, which housed the British military headquarters in the region. They killed 91 people with the bomb, and the attack weakened the morale of the British, who were exhausted and depleting following World War II. I referred earlier to these sort of ships coming in. One of the main sort of incidents was this ship called the Exodus, which had 4,500 refugees from Europe, and it was prevented from landing in what is now Israel, and there was widespread publicity that led to sympathy for the Jewish refugees worldwide and further pressure on the British. In 1947, the British sought the advice of the newly formed United Nations UN Special Committee on Palestine, which was set up to investigate and make recommendations on how to resolve the issue. The UN General Assembly accepted their report 33-13. Their main recommendation was to split up the Palestine into a Jewish and an Arab state. Jews were to be given 55% of the land. One-third of the population was supposed to be given to one-third. There were only one-third of the population were Jews, but they were to be given more land to accommodate more refugees coming in. And in what was to be the Jewish state, there would be 530,000 Jews and 400,000 Arabs. The suggested partition represented a sort of crisscross arrangement with kissing points, as they called them, which were intersections for different parts of the population to interact and travel between the borders. The Jewish Agency accepted the plan. The AHC, which is the representative of the Palestinian Arabs, rejected it. Some prominent Jewish leaders didn't like the plan because Jews didn't get Jerusalem, and that included two future prime ministers, Ben-Gurion and Menachem Begin. But by and large, the Jews accepted it. A few days after the UN voted for partition, the AHC voted for a 3-day strike. This led to violence against Jewish civilians. In December 1947, the British announced that they would leave Palestine within 5 months. This led to a cycle of attack, retaliation, and revenge. Jewish forces at this time, they had gotten what I mentioned as sort of critical experience in World War II. They were better trained, better prepared, and organized. British Member of Parliament Richard Crossman noted on a visit that the Jewish agency was, quote, the most efficient, dynamic, and toughest organization I have ever seen. The Arabs, on the other hand, had divided leadership, weak institutions, and amongst especially the neighbors, there was a lot of acrimony even amongst the different Arab countries. This would play a pivotal role in some of these conventional wars that are about to come. In 1948, volunteers from Syria and Iraq began to cross into Palestine to help. They were sponsored by the recently formed Arab League and were formed into the Arab Liberation Army, the ALA. By April 1948, Jewish forces began forced expulsion of Arabs from villages inside what was to become the Jewish state. Nearly all villages from Tel Aviv to Haifa were cleared, to use an Orwellian term, of Arab populations. Some attacks by Jews were in retaliation for Arab attacks. Some were offensive. One terrible incident was in April 1948. It was called the Deir Yassin Massacre. Irgun fighters, led by Menachem Begin, attacked the village of Deir Yassin and killed over 100 inhabitants, 75 of whom were women, elderly, or children. Begin disputed that this was a massacre, but was clear about its effects. He later wrote that, quote, the Arabs began to flee in terror even before they clashed with Jewish forces. The legend was worth a half dozen battalions to the forces of Israel, end quote. Arabs took revenge a few days later, ambushing a convoy on its way to the hospital in Jerusalem, killing 78, including doctors and nurses. And by the time the British left on May 17, 1948, over 300,000 Arabs had fled what became the independent state of Israel. There was a huge debate that's been going on ever since over whether they were expelled or whether they chose to leave or some combination of the two. There are a few interpretations of this. There are many interpretations, to be clear, but here are two major interpretations. One is what we call the Zionist interpretation, which believes that the Jewish military actions after 1947 were mostly defensive to protect the Jewish settlements and the roads linking them. They believe that in the Arab coastal towns like Haifa and Jaffa, thousands of Arabs followed the examples of their leaders who pushed them to flee. So they're basically saying that it was the Arab leaders who pushed them to flee. Another interpretation is called the revisionist history, which believes that Haganah and the Jewish agency condoned and or turned a blind eye to the operations of the Irgun and Stern Gang, which are kind of non-state paramilitary or terrorist organizations that pushed people out. This group of revisionist histories includes people like Benny Morris, who has a book that's worth checking out called Righteous Victims, which made use of declassified Israeli documents that came out in the 1970s. And they go through what they believe is a strong case that what happened went beyond the Arab leaders pushing their own people out. And so you could check those works out for yourself. This war of 1948 to 1949, which is the War of Israeli Independence, probably is kind of one way to look at it. The day after Ben-Gurion proclaimed the birth of Israel, armed forces from Syria, Iraq, Transjordan, and Egypt entered Palestine. And so, in a way, the state of Israel was born in war. That first war, that War of Independence, had three phases. Phase one was largely defensive, so Israel fighting back their invading neighbors. In phase two, the goal for Israel was to widen the corridor to Jerusalem and take Arab land allocated in the process. During that phase, phase two, the Stern Gang assassinated Count Bernadotte, who was the special UN mediator. Israel then dissolved the Stern Gang and Irgun, so these sort of paramilitary groups, and incorporated some of those elements into the IDF, so the official army. In phase three, Israel concentrated on defeating the Egyptians in the south and pursued them over the border, but under U.S. pressure, they withdrew from Egyptian territory. The simple way to look at this is Israel was invaded by its neighbors and beat them back and won the war. Israel controlled, by the end of the war, 78% of what had been the British mandate of Palestine versus the 55% which they were allocated in the war. 400,000 Palestinian Arabs had fled between 1948 and 1949. Most ended up in Gaza and what is called now the West Bank. The fight and the 1947 to 1949 period is known in Arabic as Nakba, catastrophe or disaster. For Israelis, it is known as a war for national liberation. In their view, they fended off a more powerful and the numerous invaders to their to every side, and they were able to push them back. The psychological effects of both wars, or this war on both sides, was huge. For the Arabs, it was a humiliation. For the American Jews, for the Israelis and the Jews in the region, it was anything but a humiliation. Here's what American Zionist Nahum Goldman said. He wrote, quote, "The victory offered such a glorious contrast to the centuries of persecution and humiliation, of adaptation and compromise, that it seemed to indicate the only direction that could possibly be taken from then on, to tolerate no attack and shape history." In 1949, there was an armistice agreement. Israel and Egypt confirmed the pre-war borders. Gaza would now be under Egyptian military rule. And Jordan and Israel also entered into agreement where Jordan would control the West Bank, and so the West Bank would be partitioned. Israel and Syria agreed over the sort of Golan Heights area. This armistice agreement was supposed to lead to a permanent peace treaty between the parties, but none would come between Israel and its Arab neighbors for 30 years. The sticking point, or the sticking points, were borders and refugees. The Arab countries wanted a right of return and the compensation for homes for the Palestinians who lost land and homes. Israel claimed that the Arabs created the refugee problem by invading Israel and starting the war. Now, why did Israel win this war? Number one, the Arab leaders were divided, they were poorly coordinated, and they were self-interested. You could read about the period. There's a ton of examples, like, for instance, in the third phase of fighting, none of Egypt's allies answered its appeal for help against Israeli forces. Egypt and Syria were generally suspicious of the king of Jordan and his aims, who he and his successors would continually play sides against each other and be talking to the Americans, talking to the Israelis, talking about to their Arab allies and promising all sorts of things. The Israelis also were just better trained. They had more experience in World War II and took that home with them. After the war, the Israelis' priorities were now to build the infrastructure of a new country. They wanted to facilitate rapid immigration and fend off future attacks. Now, to give you a sense of the scope of this Palestinian diaspora, from 1947 to 1949, around 700,000 were displaced. This is a disputed number, but that's, rough figure, give or take. Most of them went to the West Bank and Gaza, the rest to Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. Palestinians in the West Bank were offered Jordanian citizenship. Jordanians were eager to assimilate them and did not want them to assert a distinct Palestinian identity. The refugees in Gaza were under Egyptian military rule, which had much poorer conditions. And so this would set up a juxtaposition. West Bank, better conditions. Jordan, better conditions than in Egypt or Gaza, which would be pretty harsh conditions under the Egyptians. Now, I'm not saying they're good conditions in the West Bank, but generally speaking, better. In Lebanon, refugees were under constrained conditions as well. They were largely restricted to camps. Those who moved to Syria were denied passports and the right to vote. Traditional leaders of the Arab neighbors and the Arab countries were blamed for the loss. This led to a bit of a leadership vacuum during that period of time within sort of Palestinian leadership. There was at this period of time also the establishment of the UN Relief and Works Agency, which was tasked with providing food, shelter, and clothing for the refugees. At the establishment of Israel, about 155,000 non-Jews lived within the Israeli state. Israel officially opposed the return of refugees. Uriah Verny, an Israeli who fought in 1948 and later became a peace activist, said that the decision, quote, not to allow the 750,000 Arab refugees to return to their homes was what did most to determine the subsequent history of the conflict. Arabs who remained in Israel became Israeli citizens. This was about 15% of the population. Arab villages would continue to be subject to displacement. From 1942 to 1952, 40 more Palestinian villages were depopulated, again, to use a Orwellian term. From 1949 to 1960, this is a period generally considered the lost years of Palestinian nationalism, but it is a period in which the refugee camps became the focus, and this is the genesis of a renewed Palestinian sense of identity. There's a huge debate about when the Palestinian identity came about and all that. I'm not going to get into that here, but one thing is for sure. The existence of these refugee camps and the existence of the diaspora strengthened a sense of Palestinian identity, which would actually begin to diversify. There would be different Palestinian identities. There would be the Palestinian identity in Lebanon, in Jordan, in the West Bank, in Gaza, elsewhere. And so those distinct Palestinian sub-identities would kind of almost like, would almost become different species of the Palestinian identity, united for independence, but with different cultures in some ways. This is also a period that gives birth to Fatah, which is, the Arabic initials spell out the Movement for the Liberation of Palestine backwards. This originated in the 1950s among Palestinian students in Cairo. The key leader was Yasser Arafat, and their focus was on liberating Palestine through armed struggle. Beginning in 1954, they carried out minor attacks on Israel from Gaza. Over the years, those attacks would get more major. In 1964, when the Arab nations met in Cairo, President Nasser of Egypt, who's kind of like the big dog in the neighborhood, he's kind of the leader of the Arab countries at that point, he indicated no intention to immediately liberate Palestine. At that meeting, Arab leaders formed the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, under the leadership initially of a Nasser ally. On January 1st, 1965, Fatah called for armed struggle against Israel. They received enthusiastic support in the camps, and they weren't successful, but it was a starting point. So just at that point, you have leaders like Nasser of the Arab countries early on saying, you know what, we don't want another fight right away. But then you have the leaders coming up from the camps, like Yasser Arafat, or who have sympathizers in the camps, who are saying, we want to fight for liberation. Politics in Israel in those early days was dominated by what became known as Israeli Labor Party. Again, their first leader was Ben Gurion. No party ever secured a majority on its own, and it would always be in coalitions. It reminds me a lot of India, which gained its independence at a similar period of time. They would be dominated by the Congress Party, which is kind of the left-ish independence party in India. In Israel, it's Labor Party. And just like in India, where they have the BJP, which is Modi's party now, like there would be kind of back and forth between the right wing and the sort of center-left in Israel, just like in India. In 1956 is the Suez War. Nasser nationalized the Anglo-French-owned Suez Canal. The British and French conspired with Israel to invade Egypt, and international pressure, including by the U.S., led to the invasion being called off after 9 days. Israel stunned the Egyptians by how fast they overran their forces. Even though this was kind of a mixed result, Nasser emerged powerful in the Arab world for how he stood up to the West, and his newfound confidence, though, would become a bit of a problem for him. And this would really play out in what's called the Six-Day War in 1967. So in the lead up to this war, Nasser was goaded by Arab allies to take increasingly anti-Israeli stances. In January 1964, he convened a meeting of Arab leaders in Cairo. He declared there that the collective goal was to have the final liquidation of Israel. So here was a guy who before said that he wasn't going to do anything with Israel. It wasn't his priority. He was now saying he wanted to liquidate Israel, which really chilled the Israeli population because they had known Nasser to use nerve gas in Yemen in 1963. The historian Avi Shalom wrote, what he did was to embark on an exercise in brinkmanship that was to carry him, meaning Nasser, over the brink. And he did that. Nasser closed the Straits of Tiran, which cut off Israeli shipping routes. He called on Israel to give up land they acquired in the 1948-1949 war. He signed a defense treaty with King Hussein of Jordan. And Israel viewed all of these acts as a precursor to war, and they attacked preemptively. On dawn the morning of June 5th, 1967, they carried out airstrikes that wiped out nearly all of the Egyptian, Syrian, and Jordanian Air Force. They can gain control of the Egyptian Sinai and Syrian Golan Heights within 6 days, so gaining massive territory. They seized Gaza and the West Bank, and by the end of the war, Israel controlled all of what had been mandatory Palestine. So they basically took control of everything. After the war, at a conference of the Arab League. Arab leaders declared what is famously called the three no's: no peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, and no negotiation with Israel. So no peace, no recognition, no negotiation. In November 1967, the UN Security Council passed Resolution 242, which called for a permanent peace based on, quote, withdrawal of Israeli armed forces from territories occupied in the recent conflict, 2, respect for the right of every state in the area to live in peace within secure and recognized boundaries, free of threats or acts of force. Egypt and Jordan supported the resolution. Syria did not. Israel wound up accepting it too in 1968. Nasser was humiliated after this. He offered to resign. After the war, Israel destroyed some West Bank villages close to Jerusalem, citing security. Figures differ on the amounts of Palestinians who were displaced during that 1967 war. Israel says 150,000. Jordan says 250,000. Independent agencies put it at about 200,000. Many were refugees, though, for the second time. That is beyond dispute. Fatah had taken no part in the fighting, which is crucial because they were able to maintain their legitimacy amongst the Palestinians. They weren't viewed as the losers. They sought to rally morale after the war. Arafat moved to the West Bank to plan activities and by legend was living in caves, and he had to flee at one point dressed as a woman. On September 19th, 1967, Fatah planted a bomb at the Old Fast Hotel in West Jerusalem and hailed it as the start of an armed insurrection. During this time, there was an intense debate within Israel over what to do with the captured territory. In the words of Brigadier General Ravi Sivi, he warned that, quote, protracted military rule will enhance the hatred and deepen the rift between the inhabitants of the West Bank and Israel because of the objective steps it will be essential to adopt in order to ensure order and security. Moshe Dayan, the defense minister, proposed autonomy for the West Bank and Israel in exchange for security. Israel, though, did not act fast to create any durable solution. Shlomo Ben-Ami, who's an academic historian and later became a Labor Party minister, wrote of this period of time, quote, Israel's sin in the aftermath of the war lay in her total misunderstanding of the conditions that were created by her victory. She developed no reasonable strategy as to the best way to turn her military supremacy into a political tool and use her exploits on the battlefield in order to change the nature of her relations with the Arab world, end quote. The historian Ian Black wrote of this period of time that this was, quote, the other side of euphoria. Some called the victory a cursed blessing. The Baghdad-born Israeli writer Nassim Rejwan lamented that, quote, the sheer size of the victory, the humiliation it brought on the Arab world, and the certain knowledge that the Arabs would never, ever contemplate peace and reconciliation with Israel from a position of such crippling weakness, end quote. In the aftermath of the war, an anonymous soldier was interviewed and said, quote, I think in the next round, the Arabs' hatred towards us will be much more serious and profound. Another said, not only did this war not solve the state's problems, but it complicated them in a way that'll be very hard to solve. If you talk to a bunch of Israelis about this period of time, a lot of them will say they feel like they were damned if they did and damned if they didn't. That they would win a war, they would gain territory, which they believe is for their security, and if they didn't do that, they would be unsafe. But if they did take that territory, they would face resistance and a lack of legitimacy. Post-1967, Israel was grappling with the occupation, and Palestinians, of course, were suffering. And a pattern would emerge, which is that everything happening in Gaza would be more dramatic, although the conditions in the West Bank were not ideal either. In July of 1968, the PLO changed its covenant to say that the only Jews who would be considered Palestinians would be those who arrived before 1917, which was a revision of its earlier version, which said they would accept Jews as of 1947. In December 1968, Time magazine chose Arafat for its cover story. PLO and the PFLP began planning more international activities from Lebanon and elsewhere. In May 1970, there was a cross-border attack on a school bus that killed 12 Israeli school children. In 1968, there was the hijacking of the El Al plane in Algiers. In 1969, there was the hijacking of the TWA flight from LA to Tel Aviv. In 1971, foreign operations accounted for just 30% of PLO activities, but those would rise another 30% to 60% by 1973. The most notable of these international attacks was the Munich Games massacre by Black September. 11 Israeli hostages were killed, Arafat and the PLO disclaimed any knowledge of it, though Israelis and the CIA learned that Fatah funds were used, as well as facilities and personnel. Arafat said, quote, "Violent political action in the midst of a popular movement cannot be termed terrorism," end quote. Israel retaliated often with attacks on Syria and Lebanon. The historian Ian Black noted that the international image of Palestinians took a hit during this period of time because they became synonymous with terrorism. So these sort of big international incidents backfired. In 1969, Golda Meir, who would go on to become prime minister, said, quote, "There is no such thing as the Palestinians. It was not as though there was a Palestinian people in Palestine considering itself as a Palestinian people, and we came and threw them out of their country. They did not exist." So that was Meir's view. She didn't believe in the existence of Palestinians. In October, Meir's labor-led coalition returned to power with the largest number of seats ever won in an Israeli election. She insisted on no return to pre-1967 borders. In August of 1968, the playwright Hannah Levin produced a satirical show called You and I and the Next War. Quote, "Whenever we walk, we are three, you and I and the next war." So that gives you a sense of just how despondent people were on different sides of the fence. In 1973, they got that war, that next war, called the Yom Kippur War. So Yom Kippur is the holiest day of the Jewish year. The Egyptians and Syrians used that date to attack Israeli troops in Sinai and the Golan Heights in a secretly coordinated attack. This forced Israelis to retreat and destroyed several hundred Israeli tanks. The Israelis did not see this coming. Within days, the Israelis recovered and launched a counterattack. They were helped by an airlift of arms from the U.S., and they drove Arab armies back. And by the time the UN arranged a ceasefire, Israelis had regained Sinai and the Golan Heights and even more territory. The Israeli forces were 50 miles from Cairo and 25 miles from Damascus. The entire Egyptian Third Army was encircled by the IDF. So Israel beat them back. 6 years later, in 1979, Israel signed a peace treaty with Egypt and withdrew from the Sinai. Egypt became the first Arab state to recognize Israel. So quite a turnaround there. The Palestinian Liberation Army units were deployed in a limited role in both fronts. Jordan did not join the fighting. They sent a token force to Syria, but informed the U.S. and Israel that it was doing so and prevented the PLO from attacking from within its own territory. From then forward, the Arab states recognized the PLO as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. And a poll conducted after the war found deep support for the PLO within the West Bank and Gaza. In 1974, Arafat appeared at the UN, and this was a speech that had the most security for any speech up until that point, and he offered Israel the choice between the gun or the olive branch. 1974 also marked some major terrorist attacks. One in April that killed 18 Israelis, including 9 children. One in May at the Lebanese border, where the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine took hostages in a school. 21 teenagers died. And the psychological effects of the performance of the Egyptian and Syrian armies, plus Arafat's UN speech, plus the attacks, increased the morale and the self-esteem of Palestinians and created a perception that they were able to seize this conflict now. They felt, despite the ups and downs, that there was a path to victory. But others were less optimistic. The writer Sari Nussehay calls this period a purgatorial reality, that there was neither independence nor an integrated state. They were neither free from Israel nor equals within it. This was the period of the occupation. And the Israeli military was responsible for that occupation, first by the defense minister Moshe Dayan, who had a policy of normalization within the occupied territories, where they would use Jordanian currency as well as the dinar, which would be used alongside the shekel. They would give permits to open a business or to practice law or medicine, to drive a car, to build a house, install a water pump, to even live outside of the area registered. You need permits to basically live. And the Israeli producers largely had access to Palestinian markets, but not the other way around. By the mid-1980s, the Palestinians provided 50% of labor in agriculture and construction in Israel, so there was a lot of activity across the borders. Settlement construction became a big focus of debate both within Israel and outside of Israel. The Israeli rationale was often security, that they would want to provide a buffer zone to shield from attack from Jordan, whereas the Palestinians viewed these differently. They viewed them as land grabs. Yitzhak Rabin became prime minister in 1974. He pushed for peace, and he wanted a Jordanian-Palestinian state in the West Bank. He put proposals forward for an Israeli withdrawal of Jericho and establishment of a Jordanian administration there, the so-called Jordanian option. He faced resistance, including from his own defense minister, Shimon Peres, who favored a more aggressive settlement approach, which Rabin opposed because he said it would undermine his strategy for a peace agreement. During this period of time, the pace of settlement construction increased, especially when Likud took over after Peres, Likud being the more right-wing party in Israel. They took, their leader at that time was Menachem Begin, who took over in 1977, which ended a 30-year run of labor-led government. He appointed Ariel Sharon, a war hero, as the head of the government's ministerial settlement committee. Sharon is kind of like the Netanyahu before Netanyahu, kind of a war hero figure who would be associated with the Israeli right. This so-called Sharon settlement plan called for settlements in the western highlands of the West Bank. This was a period of time that saw the rise of terrorism. By 1967, half the population of Jordan was Palestinian. Fatah and other groups concentrated their forces in Jordan, and they recruited from refugee camps. During the first 3 months of 1968, Fatah carried out 78 attacks on Israeli targets. George Habash, who's the leader of the PFLP, said, quote, "When we hijack a plane, it has more effect than if we killed 100 Israelis in battle. The rest of the world is talking about us now." In response to these hijackings, King Hussein of Jordan ordered his army to take control of PLO bases. They killed and expelled many members of the PLO, most of whom moved to Syria and Lebanon. In revenge, the Jordanian prime minister was murdered while in Egypt. Black September took credit, and then 2 years later was Munich. The PLO in Lebanon was active. By 1970, about 250,000 Palestinians were living in Lebanon. The PLO set up bases there after being expelled from Jordan, and they would come to dominate southern Lebanon. The PLO established courts, imposed taxes, had military training. The Red Crescent Society was run by Arafat's brother, who was their chairman, who built hospitals, radio networks, newspapers. It was kind of a state within a state. And they would launch attacks on Israel. In 1975, Lebanon's largely Christian military forces tried to regain control of the south, but Palestinians resisted, and they were joined by some Lebanese Muslims. This is the Lebanese Civil War. It was Muslim against Christian. In 1978, the PLO had sent suicide attackers who attacked a bus near Tel Aviv, killing 37 passengers. Israel took that as an opportunity to invade. They seized control of the south, but would withdraw under pressure from the UN, who set up a peacekeeping mission there. I'll talk more about this. In 1982, a group of Palestinians attempted to murder an Israeli ambassador in London. It did major damage to the PLO, but also killed many civilians and made hundreds of thousands homeless. The Israelis chased PLO fighters, advancing north in Lebanon, surrounding Beirut. They launched air raids on the city and killed over 20,000 in what's called the Battle of Beirut. The U.S. intervened, and they got an agreement from the Israelis to stop shelling the city in return for PLO fighters evacuating. In September of that year, the Christian president of Lebanon was killed. His supporters took revenge, invading a refugee camp where they killed men, women, and children. Somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 were killed there. Peace activists in Israel protested their own armed forces and said that they didn't do anything to stop the massacre. An Israeli government inquiry later found that Ariel Sharon indirectly was responsible for the massacre, and he was forced to resign. Israel withdrew from Beirut but remained in the south of Lebanon. They made some enemies in the process, and this would give birth to what is called Hezbollah, organization operating out of southern Lebanon against Israel to this very day. In 1985, Israel withdrew from most of Lebanon, and this is the longest war they've ever fought. Many regard it as their first defeat. It's kind of like, a way to think about it is like their Vietnam. This then leads to a key period of time from 1987 to 1993, what is called the First Intifada, so the first uprising. And this really starts in December 1987 when an Israeli army vehicle in the Jabalia refugee camp in Gaza crashed into 2 cars, killing 4 Palestinians. Rumors spread that it was an act of revenge for the killing of an Israeli settlers that happened 2 days before. The funerals for the Palestinians became a huge demonstration that spread across the Gaza and West Bank. stone throwing and Molotov cocktails from Palestinians were met with live ammunition and tear gas from Israeli forces. Notably, the killing of a 17-year-old Palestinian, Faris Odeh, kind of ignited some passions. He was photographed throwing a stone at an Israeli tank in what became known as an iconic image of the struggle. In 1989, Hamas kidnapped and killed 2 Israeli soldiers, which deeply shocked the Israeli public. In a separate video, we'll really go deep into who Hamas is, but if you want to listen to that, we'll link in the show notes. I did it as a podcast episode where you really get into who Hamas is. The Israeli government retaliated by employing various strategies like mass arrests, curfews. One of the most controversial was what they called the broken bones policy, in which Israeli soldiers were allegedly instructed to break the limbs of Palestinian stone throwers in attempt to deter future protests. This was a period also of economic and social boycotts. Palestinians refused to buy Israeli products and even organize their own parallel education system within their schools that were closed by Israeli authorities. This first Intifada saw the rise of political graffiti, leaflets, and underground newspapers. Palestinians disseminated key messages and instructions and often were drafted by clandestine leaders who were known as Unified National Leadership of the Uprising. In 1988, the PLO issued a declaration of independence proclaiming, quote, the establishment of the state of Palestine. Arafat recognized the right of Israel to exist, and the U.S. opened up discussions with the PLO, which had until then refused to do. During that period of time, there was a budding peace movement within Israel itself. Organizations like Peace Now grew to prominence. But a major turning point of this Intifada was in 1990. Saddam Hussein warned that he would burn half of Israel, which was a veiled reference to his use of chemical weapons against the Iranians and Kurds. Arafat was close to Saddam Hussein because Saddam Hussein supported the Intifada. Within weeks, demonstrations were being held in Jordan and the West Bank in support of Saddam Hussein. One poll found 84% of West Bankers who considered Saddam a hero. 58% supported his invasion of Kuwait. That invasion of Kuwait is what triggered Operation Desert Storm, where Iraq launched Scud missiles at Tel Aviv and Haifa during that period of time as they were also invading Kuwait. Israel did not retaliate. The U.S. obviously beat back and defeated Iraq, and this was a bad look for Arafat because the Gulf War eclipsed the Intifada. Arafat's embrace of Saddam Hussein became the story, as did this sort of post-Cold War Soviet restrictions on the lifting of restrictions on Jewish immigration. That combination was just a bad combo for Arafat. This led to huge costs for Arafat in the post-war period. Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, which had a lot of Palestinian refugees, expelled 300,000 of those Palestinians in retaliation, because Kuwait was invaded by Iraq. Saudi Arabia was part of the American-led coalition. This wasn't helped by images of Palestinians who were shown cheering on the bombings of Israel, and this really just hurt, both the financial standing of Arafat's cause, but also their sort of moral credibility. In the early 90s, under the George H.W. Bush administration, there was what was called the Madrid Peace Conference in November 1991. The PLO was not there, but they were there by proxy. There was Jordanian and other Palestinian representatives. The government in Israel at the time was under Shamir, who was a Likud hard-right figure. The Bush administration was represented by James Baker. But those early talks broke down over settlements and the expulsions of the Palestinians, and really didn't go anywhere in part because of Shamir's stubbornness, in part because the PLO wasn't represented. But in January 1992, Yitzhak Rabin came back to power. Some people say that this was the most left-wing pro-peace government Israel has ever had. They froze contracts for housing and Jewish settlements, although they allowed, quote, natural growth and projects that were already underway. Arafat at the time was under exile in Tunis, watching with growing alarm at the rise of Hamas, who stepped up actions in autumn of 1992 ahead of the 5th anniversary of the Intifada. They killed 5 Israeli soldiers in ambushes in a 2-week span. Rabin, during this period of time, was accused of being soft on terrorists by Israeli right-wing figures. Arafat, for his part, was facing increasing pressure from right-wing figures within the Palestinian territories, and this would shape the decades really to come, which is, the sort of more peace sympathetic figures in Israel, like Rabin, would face increasing, pressure from the Likud figures like Ariel Sharon and eventually Netanyahu, whereas the figures like Mahmoud Abbas and Arafat before him would face tons of pressure from people like Hamas within their areas, and this would totally change the calculus here. There would be a lot of pressure, a lot of urgency to get peace done quickly before the sort of internal forces had their way. A back channel, recognizing these pressures, a back channel arose starting in January 1993 in Norway. Israeli academics and Palestinian officials were meeting. They adopted a statement of principles that included the separation of interim and permanent status issues. The interim issues, meaning the ones they could tackle right away, included Israeli withdrawal and Palestinian self-government. But the sort of more permanent issues were considered the refugees, the settlements, the borders, sovereignty, security arrangements. These were big issues that were left for what were called permanent status. At the time, the PLO was really weak. They were effectively bankrupt as a result of Arafat's embrace of Saddam Hussein, and violence was escalating as all of these talks were going on. In March of 1993, 15 Israeli civilians and soldiers were killed by Palestinians, mostly in stabbing attacks. This triggered a closing of the Green Line and ramped up the politics internally. Israel began sending, official representatives to these Norway talks. Israel introduced a concept of mutual recognition to Arafat, meaning the Israelis would recognize Palestinian statehood, and the Palestinians would recognize Israel's right to exist. Shimon Peres, who was, within the Rabin government again, and Mahmoud Abbas, who was a representative of Arafat, met in Norway, and it was reported that they met, which caused a sensation. This led to a denunciation by the Settler Council, sort of right-wing figures in Israel, and by Hamas, sort of right-wing figures in the Palestinian territories. In August of 1993, declarations of principles were signed, but they weren't made public. But in September 1993, in this iconic image on the White House lawn, Bill Clinton convinced Yitzhak Rabin to shake hands with Arafat as they agreed to these principles. The key provisions, and this is what's called Oslo I, were, number one, that they would install an elected council in the West Bank and Gaza. There would be a transition period of 5 years leading to permanent settlement based on UN resolutions 242 and 338. They would start the withdrawal from Gaza and Jericho. Within 3 years, they'd hold negotiations on Jerusalem, refugees, settlements, security arrangements. The PLO recognized Israel's right to exist in peace and security. They renounced terrorism. Israel recognized the PLO as a representative of the Palestinian people, so mutual recognition. There's been a lot of criticism of Oslo, but it was a step forward at a time when there only seemed to be steps back. But the criticisms of it were that it was vague and that Israel got most of what it wanted right away. Abbas at the time told the PLO Central Council in Tunis, quote, "Now comes the test. Can we build institutions that can rebuild the scorched land? The mind of the revolution is very different than the mind of the state." Hamas and Islamic Jihad objected forcefully. In February 1994, Baruch Goldenstein, an American-born settler in Israel, killed 29 Muslim worshippers at a mosque in Hebron. Hamas retaliated, killing 8 Israelis and injuring 49 when a car bomb exploded at a bus stop. This was the first suicide bombing by Palestinians against civilians in Israel. So at this period of time, due to some of the internal pressure, Arafat started to waver. On a visit to South Africa, he compared Oslo to an agreement the Prophet Muhammad had signed from a position of weakness, which he breached when his power increased. This signaled to Israelis that Arafat was ready to breach whenever it suited him. Shortly after that, during a meeting in Cairo with Rabin and Mubarak, Arafat signed the Gaza-Jericho Self-Rule Accord, but in front of cameras, he balked at endorsing a map of the Jericho area. In July 1994, Arafat entered the Gaza Strip, and this was the first time that he stepped foot on Palestinian territory since 1967. In October 1994, Hamas kidnapped a young Israeli soldier and gave the government 24 hours to free 200 Palestinian prisoners. He was killed. The soldier was killed by captors in a failed rescue attempt. All of this was happening as Rabin and Arafat accepted the Nobel Peace Prize, and a week later, 22 Israelis were killed in the heart of Tel Aviv when a suicide bomber targeted the number 5 bus. This was the worst terrorist attack in Israel since 1978. Arafat condemned the bombing. But the pressures in Israel were starting to become overwhelming. It was getting harder and harder for Rabin to push for peace. Outside the defense ministry, hundreds of protesters held a vigil chanting death to Rabin. And Netanyahu, who by then was a young opposition leader, said that the prime minister, Rabin, was personally responsible for those deaths. Shimon Peres said that Hamas wanted the Israelis to lose our heads and to stop the peace process. There's no way on earth. In October, Israel and Jordan finalized their peace treaty. Arafat began to beef up security in the face of internal resistance and real threats from Hamas. In January 1995, a double suicide bombing killed 19 soldiers at a bus stop. Islamic Jihad claimed responsibility. And when Rabin visited the scene of the attack, his car was attacked. So the prime minister's car was attacked by a crowd of Israelis chanting "traitor." Some protests erupted around the country with images of Rabin in an SS uniform and in a keffiyeh. But Rabin and his team plowed on. And in September 1995, they signed Oslo II. This was finalized with 300 plus pages. It has a lot in it, but it divided the occupied areas into 3 zones. In Area A, Palestinian towns and urban areas would be included. This would give the Palestinian Authority full responsibility for law and order over those areas. That would be 2.8% of the West Bank. In Area B, this would include villages and sparsely populated areas. The Palestinian Authority would be given responsibility over public order, but the Israelis would be given responsibility over security. That would be 22.9% of the West Bank territory. In Area C, this would be important agricultural areas and water sources. Israel would get full responsibility for public order and security. This is 74.3% of territory. When accepting the Nobel Prize, Rabin committed to stop building any new settlements. Oslo II said, quote, "Neither side shall take initiatives or any step that will change the status of the West Bank and Gaza pending the outcomes of the permanent status negotiations." At that point, despite, what some would say were some shortcomings of the Oslo II Accords, Palestinian support for peace was at an all-time high. 71% supported peace, including 60% of students. And, the students typically were the most hardline group. And support for Oslo II was 72% in October 1995. In Israel, Oslo II passed the Knesset, despite all the internal pressure, it passed the Knesset by a slim margin, yet right-wingers were unhappy and they were ascendant. Netanyahu denounced the deal and visited the Hebron settlers, who are kind of a divisive group in Israel. 1 month later, in November 1995, Rabin appeared at a massive peace rally in Tel Aviv. And when he descended from the stage, he was shot and killed by a man named Yigal Amir, who is a right-wing extremist who'd been planning the murder for 2 years. In the aftermath of that murder, the assassination, Rabin's widow blamed Netanyahu. And Israel and the region would really never be the same. Like, a lot of people say that was the closest they ever got to peace. In the next video, I'll talk about a few other moments where they got close to peace, and then I'll talk about this really depressing next phase of the conflict. If you like what you heard, make sure to subscribe and hit that like button. If you want to jump ahead, you can listen to the podcast versions of this history, and we'll put those links in the show notes. Thank you very much, everybody.